Hello, welcome to Talk Wildlife, and today I have Jess Owens returning and in a different role. You may remember that I interviewed her for the WWT and it was the Godwit project. Well, she's changed Godwit for something slightly larger, and that is whales. So hi Jess, how are you?
Hello, I'm good, thanks. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. So before we actually start, let's just tell people where you are, because I'm not jealous at all. But whereabouts are you in the country at the moment?
So I'm based on the Isle of Skye in the Hebrides on the west coast of Scotland.
Excellent, excellent. The only thing I'm not jealous about is it gets colder up there and it gets wetter up there than it does down here.
Yeah.
Other than that, the geology and the wildlife is amazing up there.
Yeah, I keep being reassured by neighbours that the weather's not always bad, but it's so far it's pretty windy.
Yeah, because sometimes it doesn't rain quite as hard.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're going to talk about the work of ORCA. The name gives it away. It is whales or cetaceans, and it probably a lot of people might not realise that actually our waters are quite rich for cetaceans. In the State of European Cetaceans that was released in 2019, 29 species of cetacean were recorded, which is like quite surprising because that's quite a big number. And I believe I read on the website that occasional blue whales put in an appearance.
Well, yeah, I mean they're a real rarity, but yes. So in the UK and well in Europe we get sort of roughly a third of the world species of cetaceans, so that there's roughly 90 species, although the number kind of goes up and down because as recently as a couple of months ago a new species of whale was discovered, but also there are some that are really on the brink of extinction as well. So we say there's roughly 90 species because it does go up and down a little bit, but we get a third of those in Europe, and we get a huge amount in the UK. That I think people just don't realise use our waters. They think they have to go to really tropical places to see whales and dolphins, but you don't at all.
Yeah, I think it's quite difficult actually, because they're almost like hidden giants, because you know, tigers, yeah, okay, you can go to a zoo and you can see a tiger, if that's what you want to do, but you can see a tiger. There are opportunities to see tigers. It's a lot more difficult to go and see a humpback whale because you couldn't find a cage big enough for a start. But do you know what I mean? It's so they're almost like this mythical type creature, because they're sort of, we know they're there, we know that they're incredible, and we know that they're incredibly rare and threatened, but they can't really be sort of seen and used as sort of, if you like, the pin-up, because they are so hard to see. So
yeah,
and your work quite difficult.
Yeah, well, yeah, and also you only see them when they're at the surface, and they only spend a very small amount of their time at the surface. Really, a lot of these species can hold their breath and be underwater for a really long time. So they are very much seen as mythical creatures. And when you tell people, if you're walking along the coast in Scotland or lots of places around the UK, and you say it's possible to see whales from here, they often don't believe you. Because you think, well, how would I miss something that big? But sometimes you only see a tiny sort of roll of a back and there's a huge animal underneath, but you only get this tiny glimpse. And if there's the slightest waves or rough water, then your chances of seeing them do get reduced as well. But yeah, but we do a lot of surveying on ferries and cruise routes, so you've got a bit of a vantage point. You're high up. And also a good tip as well, if you're going from land and you're up on top of a cliff, you're more likely to see things because you've got that kind of vantage point and you're a bit higher up as well.
Yeah.
But it is tricky to see them. You do have to sort of get your eye in, and you do have to practice.
Yeah, and when you do see them, I mean, I don't pretend to have seen a lot. I have seen harbour porpoise and I've seen common dolphin. Don't think I've ever seen any of the, well, I haven't seen any of the whales yet. There's always time. But they are, when you do see them, they're incredible. They're absolutely incredible species. I mean, I saw a talk by Carwardine, who's one of your patrons, and it was on a stage where the screen was flat to the floor. So there was the big screen and he was stood next to it, and there was one of the humpback breaching, and you got the scale because he was stood there. It was just amazing. So amazing creatures, but let's talk about the ones that we find around the UK. So I've mentioned harper porpoise and common dolphin. What else? What are the sort of common ones, and what are the ones that are real rarities off our coast?
Sure. So harbour porpoise is probably one of the ones that you are most likely to see. Even though they're the smallest that we get, they're about a metre and a half long, and they've got a very gentle roll to them. So they're very easy to miss. They're little and they're quick, and they don't make themselves known. A lot of dolphins will splash and will jump right out of the water, and so they're a bit more easy to spot. But yeah, porpoises you get them all around the UK. Also common dolphins, like you said, although they are more common now than perhaps they were in the past, and they've got the beautiful hourglass pattern on their flanks. We also have resident populations of bottlenose dolphins all around the UK as well. Sometimes individuals will become famous. For example, like in Cardigan Bay, they see a lot of dolphins in Wales. But you also sometimes get these lone individuals who get nicknames, and they're kind of known for approaching people and being quite interested in people as well. But you have resident populations all around and in Scotland as well. And then minke whales are probably the most common whale that we get in the UK, because they're the smallest of the baleen whales that we get here. So the ones that have baleen plates to filter out food rather than a toothed cetacean that uses echolocation. And they can be up to about 10 meters long. So we say that they're a small baleen whale, but they're still pretty enormous. And they do kind of favor the more shallow coastal waters, so you can see them quite close to land as well. So it's a bit of a hotspot, especially in the Hebrides where I am. There's a lot of minke whales too. But then you do get some real rarities as well. So typically you wouldn't think that our waters are deep enough to get things like sperm whales, but off the coast of Lewis, they've got very deep water quite close to land. And kind of to the west of the Hebrides, there's a sort of deep ocean trench, so a really deep area called the Rockall Trough, and that's almost like a migration highway for a lot of the very large whales that are going up and down on their migration. And sometimes they'll kind of pop over and take advantage of the food source on the west coast of the British Isles. So you do get things like sperm whales, and we've even had things like Cuvier's beaked whales, which is something that often a lot of people have never heard of, and they're so weird. Like, they've got such funny faces. They have little white faces and a little kind of overbite with little tusks sticking out the bottom of their lower jaw, and they get these scrape marks on them. So they've got all these patterns and these white lines, and they look like an animal that somebody has made up. So you get some really unusual stuff. And we get things like Risso's dolphins, which are quite a large species of dolphin. And I often say that they look like a children's drawing of a dolphin, not to be mean about children's drawings, but they've got these funny sort of stumpy faces. They don't have the typical beak like a lot of the more sort of iconic dolphins like bottlenose have. So they've got these funny flat faces, these long dorsal fins, and they get unusual rake marks on their bodies as well. So they will scratch each other and rake each other with their teeth. And so the older the individual, the whiter they get. So sometimes you get these bright white dolphins, and people think that maybe they've seen a beluga whale, but it can just be a very old individual Risso's. So I could go on and on. Really, there's loads of different species. We get white-beaked dolphins. Sorry?
Why do they scratch one another?
So it's thought to be a form of socialization. It's not necessarily an aggressive thing. There's kind of different theories. It could be that it's a health thing. Perhaps they're removing parasites from each other, or they think it's more to do with reaffirming social bonds, and it might be kind of like social grooming, a bit like what primates do. It could be sort of the older ones will be groomed by the little ones, and so the older they get, the more scarring they get, so they end up almost completely white. And it's just not an animal that you expect to see in the UK. They're very unusual. But yeah, I could go on. And of course, we're getting more and more sightings of humpback whales, particularly around Scotland, which is a really amazing animal. And then we do have a resident population of killer whales, which people are shocked to hear as well, on the west coast of Scotland.
Right, so we're going to come back to killer whales in a second, but you mentioned earlier on that there was a new species discovered. When was that discovered, and what was it?
That was only a few weeks ago, and it was called a Rice's whale. And that's sort of done through genetics, really. But yeah, they've just sort of realised that actually it's unique enough to be considered its own whale, basically. Right. Yeah. So quite amazing that something that big.
Sorry, is it a case that it was always there, but it wasn't split as a species, or that it's been split as a species and since been seen?
I think I'm not sure, to be honest. I don't know too much detail about it, but it's possible that it's always been there and it's just been realised now that it's unique in its genetics. But there are some species of whale that are only known through strandings, so they've never been seen alive. It's only because they wash up dead on the shores, or bits of their body parts wash up, they find them, which just shows you how big our ocean is, really, that these huge creatures can go unseen and unnoticed. It's exciting, really, that there's more to discover.
Yeah, and it's devastating that they do get washed up, and we'll come on to that in a second. But killer whales, so you mentioned killer whales, and I think because you mentioned the humpback whale, and that was the one I was going to actually pick on next, but you've now mentioned the humpback whale. Because I think humpback whales, blue whales, obviously, people have heard of, but humpback and killer whales, other than the dolphins, are probably the two that people have heard of. So killer whales, if somebody wanted to see killer whales from the UK, in UK waters, where would they go?
Well, so there is the resident population on the west coast of Scotland, and it's known as the West Coast Community. But over the last sort of 25 years that it's been studied in detail, unfortunately, a few of them have died, and there's thought to be about 8 individuals, but actually only 2 have been seen regularly over recent years. So there is concern that there's perhaps only 2 individuals left, but it could be that the others we just haven't seen them. So you can see them on the west coast, but it is a bit like looking for a needle in a haystack. If you are on the north coast of Scotland, and if you're in places like Shetland and Orkney, you're likely to see the populations that come down from Scandinavia. But my friend saw them on the east coast of Scotland in Aberdeen, and she was just, so you don't think of Aberdeen and think, oh yeah, that's where I'll see a wild killer whale. It's amazing, really. So yeah, you do sort of can get them all around Scotland, but it's not something that I would expect to see on a daily basis at all, really. There's not very many of them.
And where are the hotspots? So, if somebody was looking to seriously sort of start watching cetaceans and thought, right, I'm going to start taking my holidays in certain areas in order to be able to actually go out on a boat or whatever, what are the hotspots around the UK?
So, number one, I would always say the Hebrides. Not because I'm biased or anything, but it is incredibly rich for cetaceans, and also there's a lot of points of land. So there's kind of peninsulas that you can walk to, and you have this really wide view. So you can take in quite a lot of sea, and that's where tend to be good spots where you see them from. And it's so that I'd say the Hebrides is a real hotspot. Also all around kind of the north of Scotland, and also the east coast of Scotland. So I had a wonderful bottlenose dolphin encounter in North Berwick, next to Bass Rock. So I went there to see gannets. We were wowed by bottlenose dolphins as well. So and the bottlenoses that live in Scotland are thought to be some of the biggest in the world to cope with the cold water. So they can be sort of 3.5 meters long, which you don't realize how big they are until you see them. So basically anywhere in Scotland is really good for them. They have whales in the Clyde and in the Firth of Forth and the Moray Firth. But then also you can go down to Cornwall, and you can see quite a lot of really nice stuff off of Cornwall, and also the northeast, but also the Yorkshire coastline as well. So on the east side, yeah, you get, basically they're everywhere. I've seen them in Wales, and especially off Ireland as well. So I used to do, when I worked for ORCA previously, we used to go to Cork in the south of Ireland, and we used to see quite a lot of fin whales and the larger stuff too. So I'd say pretty much anywhere, but all you need to do really is a quick Google search, and there's a lot of information about hotspots where you can go. There's a place very close to Inverness called Channery Point, where you can go and watch the bottlenose dolphins. So yeah, there's loads out there.
Yeah, yeah. I've been there. Yeah. Well,
Have
actually,
you?
I went round to the Black Isle, so I went round the other side. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So amazing, absolutely.
Yeah,
amazing.
yeah. But there's a real network of cetacean lovers in the UK. There's a lot of whale and dolphin enthusiasts who are more than happy to help you. And I would say, if you're looking to go but you're not quite sure where you're looking for or where to go, it's really good to go with somebody who perhaps has already seen them before and can help you spot them, because there are some good hints and tips. At first you can think, this is impossible, how am I ever going to see a dorsal fin in all this water? But I'd say, you know, just talking to people are really happy to help you out and point you in the right direction.
Yeah, once we're out to play.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So excuse me, before we come on to ORCA's work, let's talk a little bit about, we've talked about, you know, there's 29 species in UK waters. We've talked about some of the species, which is incredible. We have to talk about threats, unfortunately, because it seems to be a trend that whenever you talk about wildlife, you have to talk about threats, which is a shame, but we have to do it.
Yeah.
What are the key threats to, first of all, cetaceans worldwide, but then regionally? What are the threats around UK waters?
Sure. So probably a problem that they see all around the world is a problem with bycatch. So accidentally being caught in fishing gear is a problem, particularly for larger, slower cetaceans. They're just not quite as nimble to kind of untangle themselves, but also it happens to a lot of dolphin species as well. So there's bycatch, accidentally being caught, but then there's also just entanglement in ghost gear, which is lost or abandoned fishing gear as well, which in a way is almost worse, because if fishermen accidentally catch a dolphin, sometimes they can free it and let it go, but if you don't know that fishing net is there and it's not being checked, a lot of animals can drown in abandoned fishing gear. So that's, entanglement is a really big problem. Also, a lot of the things that affect lots of other animals as well, so pollution, chemical pollution, but also noise pollution as well. They're very sensitive, particularly the ones that use echolocation to find their food. So the toothed cetaceans, they're really sensitive to loud noises. So busy shipping routes or any kind of seismic activity going on in the water, it can really frighten them, but also it can hinder them hunting. They can't hear their prey. And also it can really disorientate them as well. And that's thought to be one of the reasons why you sometimes get mass strandings, because animals get disorientated by noise and things. So then there's strandings as well, which can be caused by all sorts of things. So chemical pollution. Sometimes you get large species washing up that are found to have really high levels of certain chemicals in their bodies. And that's thought to be a case of because of bioaccumulation. So these chemicals going up the food chain and getting bigger and magnified as they get to the large predators. So that's another problem as well. Also, whaling is still an industry that happens in the world. There was an international ban on whaling. The moratorium was in 1986. but there were 3 countries that didn't want to take part in the ban, and they still commercially hunt whales today as well. And you can't deny that has an impact on numbers too. And then ship strike as well. Sometimes large whales, they do get hit by large ships, particularly in busy shipping areas, and they struggle to move out of the way in time, or even hear them in time. A lot of these large whales are the baleen whales, and perhaps their underwater hearing is not quite as acute as the toothed cetaceans, and so they just can't move out of the way in time. And often a lot of juveniles will fall victim to that because they're just not experienced and they don't know how to be around the boats and how to avoid them. So there's all sorts of threats really, and pretty much everything that affects them in the UK, it happens all over the world as well. It is a global thing. So it sounds very depressing, but there are lots of projects that are trying to right this wrong. But of course, marine litter is a really big one as well. So plastic pollution, as I'm sure you know, lots of people are very aware of it now, which is really good. But you do get whales getting stranded, and when they are dissected to find out what was wrong with them, they have huge amounts of plastic in their system. So there's, it sounds very depressing and the problem is very vast, but there are a lot of people working hard to try and right these wrongs.
There are, yeah, and it's the same with all conservation. You know, you do hear a lot about the negatives, and I think as a species, we sort of are drawn more towards the negatives than the positives, which is why the media puts all the negatives out and tends to ignore the positives. And, you know, there are a lot of positives in conservation. And ORCA, having read about ORCA and how you're working with people and citizen scientists, and also with a commercial company, you know, that to me is very positive. So do you want to give us a bit of an overview of ORCA and what they do? But before you do, questions just popped in my mind. This happens.
That's okay.
We're seeing a lot of wind turbines put out in the sea. And I'm all for it because we've got to go with clean energy. However, we know about bird strike and we know that can potentially be an issue. And there's a lot of research going in on that. How was that? Because you mentioned noise, and I'm assuming, I've never been close enough to find out, but I'm assuming that one of these things alone will make a lot of noise. If you add up sort of tens or hundreds of these in one spot, it will make a lot of noise. Is there any research into how that's having an impact on the cetaceans?
There undoubtedly is, yeah. So I'm not so clued up on wind turbines specifically, but yeah, that's undoubtedly going to be vibrations made by those machines, and there's probably ongoing research, but probably when they're deciding where these wind turbines are going to go, there will have been a lot of surveys and a lot of research into which areas are best to put them. They wouldn't put them in places that are known for kind of being a really important, perhaps breeding ground or feeding ground for a certain cetacean. Well, you would hope they wouldn't anyway.
Yeah.
And you'd hope that they would do lots of environmental surveys beforehand. So yeah. Thanks for that. Sorry, I went off on a tangent. No, that's okay.
But it just suddenly struck me. I thought they must be noisy things.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So let's come back to ORCA, because you know what you're doing is very positive and quite tricky to get your head around. So let's start off by saying, right, give us a little bit of background to ORCA and the work they do, because when I was reading the website, when I was researching for this interview, I was thinking, so, okay, we've got a tiger and we've got a tiger in a certain habitat, and we can go, right, okay, well, if we look after that habitat, we're looking after the tiger. It's not as black and white when you've got, well, we've got these whales somewhere out there and we're going to sort of look after these whales. And tell us how you go about doing it. So tell us about ORCA first of all.
Sure, yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, there's lots of challenges in studying and protecting cetaceans, because they are very wide ranging, and yeah, they're not confined to one space. So ORCA was set up in 2001, and it's a charity that's basically dedicated to the long-term protection of cetaceans, so whales, dolphins and porpoises. And basically their mission really is they want to see more whales and dolphins in the oceans. They want them to be alive with whales and dolphins for all sorts of reasons. They're not just these beautiful, big, iconic animals. They're actually an extremely important part of the ecosystem, as well. As we've learned recently that the little things in the ecosystems are extremely important, but apex predators and large animals can be ocean and ecosystem engineers as well. So the mission is we want more of them, and we want more protected areas for them, really. So, and we also really want to sort of do this through empowering people to have a love and appreciation for whales and dolphins and an understanding of them, and also give them opportunities to safeguard them as well. So ORCA's kind of got three main areas of work in which it tries to meet this goal. So the first one is their research and their citizen science. So they have a very big pool, a very big network of marine mammal surveyors who are volunteers who go out onto what we call platforms of opportunity, which is basically ferries and cruise routes. So these are vessels that are going to be making journeys anyway, and they often take the same route. And they often travel in a straight line. So they're like a perfect scientific transect. And it means that you can do your surveys from a ferry, and they're observational surveys where you write down, you go on effort and you write down whenever you see a cetacean and where you see it, the behavior that it's doing and that it's displaying, and where it might be traveling, whether it has calves with it, what species and how many. And then we can compare that data year on year, because that ferry does the same routes every year. So you can start to look at whether there's increases or decreases in certain species being seen in those areas. And this is mostly done by volunteers. So there's that side of it. So it's very much a kind of research focused charity, collecting all this usable data that can then be used to inform policymakers. So then the next sort of branch of ORCA is using this information to help with creating things like MPAs, so marine protected areas and special areas of conservation. So using the data to inform decision makers and providing evidence for the protection of these animals is their next big kind of main area that they work in. And then finally, the third one is through education and their educational programs. So there's a lot of strings to their bow, really. So we do schoolwork, but also we have the wildlife officer program, and that's what I am. I'm the Hebrides wildlife officer, and they have a version of me in the Bay of Biscay and also in the North Sea as well. So we work with ferry companies, helping passengers to spot these animals and inspire them and get them interested in them, but also getting them to help with collecting the data as well. So we've struck up these really nice relationships with ferry and cruise companies, because we can use their vessels to collect the data, because we as a tiny charity can't afford our own fleet of ships. And then in exchange they get a lovely whale watching experience for their passengers, but also they get to help in collecting this data, which is going to help the seas around them, really. So there's a lot going on. And then also within the research side, we have PhD students that come and do studies on looking at how you can minimize ship strike, particularly for the more vulnerable species like fin whales. And there's a lot going on. Basically, it's hard to kind of summarize, but the main focus is research that then informs policy, and then the education side as well. But I think what's really nice about it is that a lot of people that are going out and collecting the data, they're not necessarily scientists. There's a really sort of citizen science heavy focus on the whole thing, really. So it's very exciting to be a part of, and you get to travel and see really amazing animals and feel like you're gathering data to protect them.
Yeah, and I think, getting back to what I said in the introduction, where, these things are sort of invisible for most of the time. I think the education element is key, to, make sure that people are aware that not only are they out there and that they are fascinating creatures, but that they need protection. So I think the education is absolutely critical.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned something, and I was going to come back on it, and I thought I'll come back on that. It'll come to me in a second. But in the meantime, let's talk about Humpback ferries.
Great.
Because you sent me a link to their website, and I thought, oh, why should you send me a link to a ferry company? And when I looked into it, I thought, actually, yeah, brilliant. Here's a company that, clearly make a sort of living, a profit from being on the sea. And yet they are balancing that with being sort of very conservation oriented. So give us an idea of how ORCA and them work together.
Sure. So ORCA's been working with Humpback ferries for about 5 years now. And originally we started working with them because they were part of our Ocean Watchers project. So staff from ORCA were training ship crews and staff to collect data for them whilst they were out on their sort of general routes. So from the bridge, and training the bridge crew in how to spot these animals, just learn more about them and become active in collecting data for us. And that was how we initially got involved with them. And they've always been really keen and really interested to learn more. And then the Wildlife Officer Programme got set up in 2018. And that was where a wildlife officer like me was based on Humpback ferry routes, helping passengers see the wildlife that was around them, and also collecting data from the ferries as well. And that's part of Humpback's marine awareness program. So they actually have they have relationships with quite a lot of different organizations, and one of the main focuses is citizen science. So with us, they collect the marine mammal data, but with JNCC as well, they do seabird surveys too, and they're volunteer based as well. So it's wonderful, really. So, and their passengers can get involved with collecting the data whilst they're perhaps travelling to their holiday destination or commuting from one island to the other. So it's a fantastic relationship, and we've got these kind of relationships with lots of ferry and cruise companies. And Humpback, well, they're just so keen to make a difference and to help us. And it's a great program. And the other side of the program is the education side as well. Yeah.
It's brilliant. As I say, I read the website on what they're doing, and so well done, Humpback, because that is great. More of you type companies, please. Right, so let's come back to, you talked about volunteers and citizen science, and clearly we all know the importance of citizen science and volunteers. As an individual, how can somebody get involved with what you're doing and maybe travel on the ferries? Do you give them training? How does it all work? How can they get involved?
So there's lots of ways you can get involved. So initially, if you wanted to just come and test it out and see if you liked it, you could book onto a ferry that perhaps a wildlife officer is going to be on. So the Wildlife Officer Programme is for in the Hebrides, it's me on Humpback ferries, and I do 5 routes mainly. So I'll go to Stornoway on Lewis, go to Harris and Uist from the Isle of Skye, go from Malay to the Small Isles, and then Oban to Tyree, Columbarra, and then down to the Isle of Bute as well. So you can have a look on Humpback's website, and there'll be kind of dedicated wildlife watching mini cruises where I'll be there collecting data and helping passengers spot wildlife. So if you wanted to just get a taster, and if you're in Scotland, you could do that. But also we have a wildlife officer programme with Brittany Ferries, and in the North Sea as well. So you could look into that. Also, as I say, what's great about ORCA is you don't necessarily have to have a scientific background. So if you wanted to get more involved and do surveys yourself and become a marine mammal surveyor, then you can do a 1-day training course with ORCA that equips you with everything you need. And that's a training course that you would then go out onto the bridges and do surveys from the bridge. which is really cool because you get to sort of meet the captain and you get this fantastic view from the bridge, and it's warm, you're out of the elements, which is really nice. And that is something that we wouldn't then just send you off on your own to do a survey. You'd always get put in a team of, there usually is 4 of you, and you'd always be with someone who is experienced and who would be able to help you out there. And then of course, if you wanted to, you could become a member with ORCA, and then from that you could also, we offer courses, so we're about to introduce an app, so that you can do surveys from land too. So even if you don't like boats, if you get seasick, you can help us from land as well by doing the survey with the app too. So there's lots of ways that you can get involved, and if you're not a sea goer, there's other things as well. So there's there's all sorts of kind of interesting ways that you can get involved.
Excellent. And it sounds a very satisfying role. You know, that number one, you're out looking for cetaceans, which in itself is satisfying, but number two, you're helping educate people about them, and help, because I know, being an education officer in wildlife, what it's like when you actually tell somebody about a piece of, you know, some wildlife that they may not have seen before. The buzz they get from that, you must get a real buzz from that.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's like what we were saying at the start, how these animals, people don't know that they're even real sometimes, and to have a job where you facilitate an opportunity for them to see these animals is really nice. And when people do get their eye in, they then go on to see many more cetaceans that they might not have seen if they hadn't had that initial contact with you, and if you hadn't said, if you watch the sea, you know, the longer you watch the sea, the more likely something is to pop up. So it's really nice to be able to show people what's there, because ultimately they won't be interested in its protection if they don't know that it exists, and they won't even take an interest in things like MPAs if they don't realize that there's so much rich wildlife there that needs protecting. So it does feel like a very worthwhile job, and it's really nice. I've had lovely experiences where people see their first whale or first dolphin, and they get kind of emotional because it's not something you expect to see at all, and it's lovely. You know, I've had so I used to work for ORCA on Brittany Ferries. I was the wildlife officer in the Bay of Biscay too, and it was kind of lovely because you had just such a mix of people from all different walks of life. Some people were on their hen do's and stag do's, and some people were lorry drivers just transporting products from one place to another. And I had a group of lorry drivers who were just delighted to see a group of dolphins, and I thought, wow, that's so nice. They would never have normally have got to experience that, and maybe they'll go on to take more of an interest in the ocean, something that's sort of been out of sight, out of mind for many years, really.
Yeah. So
yeah, it feels like a very worthwhile job, and it's just lovely to meet lots of different people, and as soon as they see you, they start telling you about things that they've seen, and it's lovely. Yeah, it's excellent.
Great stuff. So before we end, I mean, ORCA clearly doing a great job. Shout out again for Humpback Ferries, because that's brilliant. But I can't leave it without talking a bit more about the whale species that we get around.
Please do, yeah. I'm always happy to talk more about whales.
Well, yeah, only because it's a fascinating subject, and you know, it is something that, you know, it's an unknown to so many people. So we talked about 29 species, and you did mention a few, and you mentioned the sperm whale. Mm-hmm. So let's just touch on the sperm whale for a second, because the sperm whale is a deep sea specialist. It's hard to say that, a deep sea specialist, but it's a deep sea specialist. Are they relatively regular off our shores, or, you know, how often would you see a sperm whale?
It's not a weekly thing. It would be unusual. I would be surprised if I was to see a sperm whale in the Hebrides or anywhere around the UK, really, but it is possible. So they are a migratory species, and it's usually when they are on their migration that they pass by So I don't know if you remember a few years ago that there was quite a lot of sperm whale strandings, and there was some on the Norfolk coast, and it was thought that these whales got disorientated and basically came down the wrong channel, and went the wrong way, and ended up in water that was far too shallow for them, and not enough habitat. So it's around the UK is not necessarily ideal sperm whale habitat, but in the deeper areas around the UK, you can definitely see them sort of passing through or stopping for a rest. And we do have some areas that are quite rich in things like squid, which is their prey. So yeah, so I would be surprised to see a sperm whale, and I would feel very lucky. But it's not completely unknown to see them off the UK. But yeah, like you said, they are deep diving species. They can dive to about 2,000 meters. And they're a very iconic species as well. So the only time I've seen them is in the Bay of Biscay, because that is like 4,000 meters deep, most of that area. So but you only tend to see a slither of back. They almost look like logs when they're floating in the water, apart from if you're really lucky and if you were to see one breaching, and then you'd get to see the whole thing, which is not something I've seen. But they're really cool, and a good thing if you want to see one, and if you're in areas that is good for them, a good thing to look out for is their blow. They've got a very distinctive blow, because their blowhole is unusual in that it's on the left hand side of their head. So when they blow and it's calm and not too windy, it blows at a bit of an angle. Whereas most whales, their blow goes straight up, whereas a sperm whale, it goes out to the side. But if it's a windy day, a fin whale blow that goes straight up can look like a sperm whale going off to the side. So you have to be aware of the conditions. But that's a little tip if you want to see sperm whales, or if you think you've seen one.
Yeah. And you've mentioned two things. Number one is residents, and number two is migrants. So presumably, it's quite a tricky thing, because I mean, whales are constantly on the move. They sort of, a residence. Let's talk about the resident, the killer whales that are residents.
Yeah.
What area are we talking about there? How big an area does it take for a pod of killer whales to be called a resident?
Well, I suppose it depends on the size of the group, and also their prey, because you get two, I suppose you would maybe call them ecotypes, in that you get fish eating killer whales, and then you get seal mammal eating ones, and usually the residents are the fish eating ones, and then the mammals are a bit more transient, but not always. So it depends what they're eating and what their prey is, because how far their prey travels will depend on how far they travel and things like that. It's thought that there's 8 individuals in the West Coast community, and they get seen off of Northern Ireland as well. So they've got a pretty big range. And although we say they're resident to the West Coast, it doesn't mean that they're there all the time. They do have very large ranges. And the ones that you see from the Shetlands and the Orkney Islands, they'll be kind of up and down using that whole area. So it's hard to pinpoint them, but you do get a lot of species that are really sort of site faithful in terms of their migration. So like minke whales will travel south for the winter into the warmer waters, and they'll come back, and quite often the ones that are seen in Scotland, they've got a unique identifying feature, and sometimes the same individual is spotted in almost the exact same place. So they do tend to have their favorite spots, but it's quite unique to that individual as well. So in the Hebrides, for example, there's some bottlenose dolphins that often get seen off of Barra, and they call them the Barra boys, even though they're a breeding population, so there must be females in there too. But they get nicknames and things, and there's Risso's dolphins that are frequently seen off the Isle of Lewis, and it's thought that they use that area for feeding and breeding, and that it's the same individuals. So it's very dependent on the species, but also the individual as well, as to whether they're really site faithful or if they've got a huge range as well. And it's really dependent on food availability as well. So that's the thing, you can never go to a place and guarantee that they're going to be there, but you can have a good a good chance. So there's, like I said, there's really active communities. If you were to go on Facebook and look at some local Facebook pages, people post about when they've seen animals, and that's often your best chance. You know, you'll get a notification that says the killer whales are next to Mull, and then you can race down to the Isle of Mull, that kind of thing.
I will. I'll race up to the Isle of Mull.
Yeah.
Another quick question before we end, and it might be a bit of a naive question, but it'll just show how much I know about whales. So the migrate, we've got that, and there's a few resident, we've got that. Do we have species that migrate, like you'd get a bird that would migrate from south of Africa, the Sahara, they'd come up here and they'd breed here? Do you get whales that are migrating into UK waters to breed, or are they passing through?
So usually, again, it's very species dependent, but for example, if you're talking about humpback whales, they'll often be passing through, but also, just like birds, they might have stop-off points on their migration where they refuel. So they'll use the UK to maybe stop and eat a load of herring, and then carry on, like a bit like a service station on the motorway. So for some, the UK is their destination. So like the minke whales will spend the summer there. Some will pass through, but it's yeah, again, it's very varied. So the humpback whales that visit Scotland through Fluke Recognition. So underneath their tail, which is called their fluke, they have a pattern which is like a fingerprint, and it's unique to them. Lots of people photograph them when they see them, and there's a lot of humpback whale catalogues out there online, and you can match them to where they've been seen elsewhere. So some of the ones that get seen in Scotland, they actually feed right up north in places like Iceland and Norway, but then they'll maybe breed down in the Caribbean, and they'll be stopping off in the UK on the way to either their feeding grounds in the north or their breeding grounds in the south. So it's very varied, really. They've all got their own routines. Yeah.
Right. Okay. I'm going to stop, because I really could talk forever about this, because it's a topic that I don't pretend to know a lot about, but I do find it fascinating. And one day, I might end up on a ferry going out with you for whales, because that would be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, we've just scratched the surface, really, in terms of the information. Like their evolution is really fascinating, their feeding behaviors, the way they interact with each other, just their intelligence alone. They're really quite advanced. There's a lot more to them than meets the eye, and you see the slither of the back, but there's so much more going on down there.
Yeah, well, you see, that is our next interview.
I think it's a whole other talk. Yeah,
it's definitely our next interview. I think what we need to do is plan something in for the next sort of month or so, and do a follow-up to this one, and really give people an insight into whales. And what we'll do is we'll try and compete with the inside out of flies, and see if we can knock Erica off the pedestal, because that is an amazing interview. I love talking about fly anatomy. So let's talk about whales and see if we can put whales up there on a par with flies.
Yeah. Well, by then as well, I'll have actually been able to get out onto the ferries as well, because at the moment I'm home based, and so I've not seen any cetaceans yet this season. So hopefully I'll be able to report back with some really nice sightings that we've seen. And well, if we get nice weather in Scotland, it's always a gamble.
Excellent. Well, what we'll do is we'll give you a little bit of time so you can go out and see a few to report back on, and then we'll plan in the next interview, which will be all about whales and their life.
Sounds great. Perfect.
Fantastic. Jess, thanks ever so much for your time. All the best up there. I'm sure you'll get out on the ferry soon. And as I say, we will talk in a couple of months, and we will talk about whales, because endlessly fascinating topics. So we'll definitely, maybe it might take more than one interview, but we'll get through it.
Yeah, definitely. And in the meantime, there's the website if people want more information. So it's orcaweb.org.uk. And also we're on all the social media pages. So there's Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, where we'll be posting about what we see and where. And there'll be blogs on our website and on the CalMac website as well. So just to keep in touch as well. And if anybody anywhere wants to contact me, you can just email me if you've got any questions at all. But yeah, thank you very much for having me. It's been brilliant.
No problem. And I'll put a link to the website underneath the video, as I normally do, so people can actually go on and find out more.
Great. Thank you.
Jess, thanks ever so much for your time, and I'll speak to you in a couple of months.
Okay, cheers. Thank you.
Take care. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.